Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon for everyone. First of all, I would like to introduce our presenters. John O'Sullivan, British conservative political commentator and journalist. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Gladden Papin, an American political scientist, associate professor of politics at the University of Dallas, and the co-founder of American Affairs. Ed West, British writer, journalist and blogger, and Julius Strauss, wilderness guide, activist, journalist, and writer. Thank you very much again for accepting the invitation. And my first question, according to the topic, is that how do you see, what is the line between freedom of expression and hate speech? John O'Sullivan, please, first.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good. Traditionally in the English-speaking world, the decision on whether or not to prohibit speech has been based not upon the content of the speech, but upon whether or not it was likely to do certain kinds of damage. The damage had to be clear, and there had to be no good reasons for inflicting the damage. But fundamentally, the rules were that if you said something that was going to be a serious breach of military intelligence, that would be considered out of bounds. In Britain, there's something called the D notice, which was something that was sent effectively, confidentially or privately or secretly, if you prefer, to editors of newspapers about particular stories which were felt to be damaging to national security. And under the conventions which ruled, I think, until very recently, in the main, I think still do, unlike America, where editors would not accept that prior restraint, that system worked well. The second worked effectively. The second was libel. If you damage someone's reputation, they could take you to court and try to restore it if the allegations you were making were false. So you, in a sense, had to be prepared to stand by and produce evidence for what you'd said that was damaging to another person. Now, my own view, there was no prior restraint there. You could say it, and then you'd face a court case if you were lying. I've always thought, I always rather liked that in one sense. It meant that journalists had to have good evidence before they made serious allegations against people. But at the same time, as the law developed, it became effectively a method of censorship, and that has to be dealt with. I say that because a very rich man, let's say a foreign despot, might sue to prevent a book being published damaging to him. And effectively, the very fact that the publisher had to face the possible loss of his entire print run of the book, that would be something that you would not want to risk. So you could effectively censor a book in advance using the libel laws, and that's gone too far, and we should amend that. The third was if the words you were using were liable to produce a breach of the peace. That had to be a serious thing. Fighting words was the traditional term, and it's been, although it has been used to effectively censor things in certain cases. For example, in America, well, I'll go on to that later in the First World War, but still, otherwise, it wasn't the content of the speech, but the impact it would have on public disorder, the private reputation of somebody, or a military risk of military information leaking out, damaging to national security. They were the only reasons you could censor things, or that became the law gradually in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think that is the right way to go. I would not otherwise have a rule of censoring opinions, political opinions, however odious. I would not censor, for example, Nazi opinions. First of all, I think that Nazi opinions are easily discredited by argument, and the fact that the Nazis actually did exist for 12 years and acted as they did means that it's easier to discredit the opinions that might have been harder to, you'd have to make a more difficult case. So any political opinion, I'm not happy to see published. I hate most of them, but I'm prepared to tolerate their being published. Tolerance being a willingness to accept the publication of something you don't like. Otherwise, there's no credit in allowing the publication of things you're persuaded about or convinced about. So I would say that the notion of hate speech should not exist. That is to say, something that you ban on the grounds of hatred, of its expression, unless it's liable to cause a breach of the peace here and now. It's not enough to say it annoys people. It has to be here and now. And so the tendency in American politics and law being driven now by the left to declare a lot of speeches to say that the First Amendment of guaranteeing free speech does not apply to certain opinions that they dislike. I completely reject that argument, and I don't think that makes me an extreme libertarian. It makes me a free speech, classical liberal in accordance with the perfectly reasonable traditions of English and American law.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, John. I'm really glad John began with that summary of the history of English law, because that situation basically prevailed from the late 1600s for about 250 years. That liberty of the press or liberty of speech didn't mean that you could just say anything with any consequence, no matter how revolutionary or inflammatory, but that the speech wasn't reviewed beforehand by a censor, and that you didn't have to be licensed in order to operate a press. One other aspect of the old situation, I'm going to make one comment about this, the older situation of liberty of speech that goes along with what he said, and one comment about how left liberalism has changed this. And one element of the older system is that if you're evaluating whether there could be dangerous or really, really bad destructive consequences of something, where it is said and in what context it is said makes a lot of difference. So let's speak a little bit ahistorically and talk about something that's been in the news a lot recently, namely analysis of and discussion of human sexuality, and the categories that we use to speak about sex, sexuality, human relations, etc. There was always, throughout the Western tradition, a great deal of liberty of discussion, even around, if you will, edgy topics in academia, in the university setting, in courts like royal courts or political courts, where people were talking. Famously, like Thomas Aquinas's Summa begins every single question of it with a statement of the opposite view. So, does God exist? Well, here are all the reasons why God does not exist. So, obviously, that wasn't, censored. It wasn't like a violation of speech, but it was also in a certain context. It would have been, arguably, they would have considered it inflammatory to go out into the city square and start haranguing children with signs that said, God is fake, God doesn't exist, your religion is vain, something like that. And effectively, that's what we're now dealing with. Hungary has the child protection law. There's been a lot of controversy around this. We've forgotten this element of context. There's always going to be a certain liberty of discussion, particularly in the universities. But what's happening now is that activists are rapidly taking the most extreme things that are said in universities and confronting 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds with them, which is not what anyone has ever meant by liberty of speech in the history of the world. Right? So this gets to the second little observation that I'll make, namely that the left liberals have played a couple of different sides of this question. They have used they've exaggerated at many points the liberty aspect in American jurisprudence throughout the 20th century, they steadily took apart any protections of the community against seditious speech. This is starting with, this basically was a project of left liberals to defend public inflammatory seditious speech by communists, starting in the 1920s and 1930s, and all of the ways of protecting against that were kind of narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. The obscenity laws, or the laws against obscenity, were steadily worn back. So fast forward to today, you could say anything to destroy the old system. You could pump out any obscenity no matter what, with basically no limits and no way to restrict it. And then they insert the concept of hate speech to further prohibit affirming any timeless human truths. Like, you can no longer say a man is a man, a woman is a woman. That's hate speech. So there's quite a bit of dishonesty at the bottom of the contemporary system. They expanded the category of liberty of speech or freedom of speech really wide, so that it included all sorts of sewage and obscenity that never would have been protected. And then in the universities, which were traditionally an area, even in the Middle Ages, where people could talk about almost anything, they've introduced speech codes, which are being used to prevent us from observing basic facts. So it's really a mess.
Thank you very much, John and Gladden. And my next question is for Ed West, that in political journalism, where are the borders, according to the English tradition, between hate speech and free speech?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I suppose you might also ask where are the borders between criticism of religion and blasphemy. In the sort of Anglo-American tradition, our idea of liberalism emerged out of the wars of religion, and the feeling afterwards that politics and sectarianism had to take a back seat, in the sense that people can use the laws to impose their sort of particular sectarian views. I mean, that obviously that had fuller expression in the United States, where there were rival different churches were established with the agreement that none of them would oppress the others. So the difference mainly, this is where it comes to the problem, is that America has protections which Britain doesn't, and so there is no First Amendment in Britain. So this age of liberalism arose out of the wars of religion, and it sort of lasted fine as long as Christianity was a sort of guiding vision in the society. Now we have this. I mean, it's been said loads of times by many people that politics and religion have sort of merged to a certain extent, but there is there's a genuine fear that people in the English-speaking world see their political moral view in a very religious way, and therefore it makes it very hard. It makes it very hard to sort of accept criticism of that, hostility to that, or opposition to that. So there is a genuine feeling that conservatives aren't just misguided, but they are actually evil or actually threatening to people. They're particularly threatening to sort of sexual minorities, and that's the feeling that if we don't sort of have these kind of endless sort of succession of like pride festivals or laws protecting sexual minorities, that conservatives will oppress them. And another aspect of the system is directed towards racial diversity. So there is sort of paradox where diversity is supposed to be a good thing in the West, but it also needs to be hugely managed with lots of laws, because the implication is that it's so combustible otherwise that if there's any kind of criticism, we're all going to sort of at each other's throats. So the example of where Britain and America differ is we've had recent cases where there are two high-profile cases of women who were actually visited by police and charged with the crime of saying that people cannot change sex, which is, been a biological fact since the beginning of time, which is indisputably a biological fact. And they were literally taken to court, and all the women have so far won their cases, and they've been hugely high-profile in Britain. But the fact that you can actually fear the police coming to your door for saying something which is so not even, not particularly extreme, but so blandly obvious. That does inevitably have a chilling effect on freedom of speech. And on one level, there's a slightly comical element to this, because it's this kind of pantomime about woke theatre and this politics and student politics, which a lot of people think doesn't really matter, but it does have real world consequences. Just in Britain this week, there's been the case finally coming about the review of this NHS clinic, which was dealing with children with gender dysmorphia who were saying they were from the wrong gender. And in some cases, they were being basically put on the path towards sex change operations before they were grown-ups. And these children are left sterile. They are left with long-term sort of disabilities as a result. And it's a horrific case. And it probably wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't a sort of chilling effect on this issue, which has become sort of basically sacred to a lot of people. So it's it's real life consequences for the problem of not being able to freely discuss things.
I'm going to take this from a slightly different point of view, because the gentlemen here know much more about the legal side of this issue than I do, and more about the history of this issue than I do. But I still am a journalist. I've been a journalist for a very long time. I do other things as well sometimes, but a lot of that time I've spent working in war zones and very extreme places, in the sense that what is said, what is written, what is reported often has immediate and sometimes violent consequence. So I'm conflicted on this issue. I can see times when somebody might make an allegation to me that I would not want to report, because I just simply think it's not true. There are other times, if somebody, I don't know, I started out in Bosnia, if a Bosnian Serb had said to me, the Muslims killed, 32,000 Serbs in eastern Bosnia last week, I would certainly not report that as a quote. You would have to go in and find out what had actually happened and get some more details. And if you do use that quote, you're going to have to heavily contextualize it. Otherwise, you're simply going to mislead readers. It's very difficult for the readers to know what to do. On the other side, you also have to resist the temptation to impose your worldview onto something. So, in every situation you're in, however radical it is, you're always going to have some personal opinion, something you've taken into that. And you have to be really careful about not allowing that to come through in your reporting. If you look at some of the basic sort of theories of media, and I'm really talking about this from a media point of view, there's this sort of communist theory of media where the media serves the party's interest. Nothing to do with the truth necessarily, it's there to promote the party. There's a sort of a libertarian view, which these gentlemen have talked about a little bit, which suggests that you can sort of do more or less what you want to with the media, and it's often driven by profit, it's often to do with how much money you make with your newspaper or television station or whatever. And then there's the sort of socially responsible media, which is something in between. I think The Guardian is probably in that category, socially responsible media. So the idea is you report things in such a way that makes the world slightly better, which sounds like a good thing, but it's dangerous. It's very dangerous because you are basically imposing your views onto other people. So I'll give you one concrete example. When I was in Kosovo at the end of the war, I'd been there for a year and a half. Most of what I had seen was Serbs massacring Albanians. And I suddenly went to a site where Albanians had massacred Serbs. And there was something in me that said, don't report this, this is wrong, this is not the big picture. And also, it may have consequence. Serbs may go out and kill Albanians as a result of what you write. But as a journalist, you have to write that story. You just have to. You don't get to play God. You don't get to say, well, the consequence of this might be this or might be that, and therefore I can't do it. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that you have to balance different imperatives on the ground when you're dealing with these kind of situations. But I think you have to, for me, my personal view is you have to err on the side of the truth rather than the effect. Because to do anything else is just it might be a good thing in the very short term, but long term, you're destroying the value of truth. And for me, truth has an intrinsic value in and of itself that is nothing to do with whether it's left-wing or right-wing or good or bad or anything like that.
Thank you very much. Julius, you have been lots of countries. How do you see, how culturally relative what we mean about free speech and hate speech? For example, in a war zone, what are your experiences?
Gosh. I mean, again, there are lines. There are lines here, and sometimes these lines are difficult to discern. I lived in Russia for 4 years, and I speak Russian up to a certain level. And I watched a lot of Russian television in the lead up to the war, the beginning of the war on February the 24th. And Russian media was definitely spinning a line very strongly. It was pushing forward its own agenda. It was making Russia look, come across in the best possible light. But it was basically factual. You could argue about the interpretation. In fact, I would definitely argue about the interpretation, but it was basically factual. From February the 24th onwards, it was no longer factual. It was, huge amounts of it was just fabrication. They invented massacres that never happened. And at that point, interestingly, RT, Russia Today as it used to be, RT was banned in several Western countries. I'm a bit conflicted on that issue. I don't think it was definitely wrong to ban it, and I can see the argument, but I can also see some arguments for leaving it to broadcast. But there's a point at which you are propagating views that have nothing to do with the truth. You know they have nothing to do with the truth. There's lots of evidence they have nothing to do with the truth. And in that case, perhaps you have to step in as a sort of a moderator, either as a journalist or as a media authority or whatever it is. But there's other times when you just don't like the truth. And then it's not your job to stop that information getting out or stop that messaging. And really as a journalist, it's a little bit old-fashioned to say this now, but really as a journalist, your job is to try and find the facts on the ground, put them in a package that is intelligible and pass them on to your readers. It's not really to pass judgment over what is happening. Certainly not on the news pages, perhaps on the opinion pages it's different. I mean, I think the big thing about war is that there's nothing new, war doesn't create anything new in terms of problems, but it accentuates problems. It makes problems much higher consequence. And sometimes you have to be really, really careful. You go into a village and you report something, you get it wrong, people might get killed as a consequence. There could be rioting or mob attacks or even arrests or whatever it is. It can get very complicated. One thing I loved about covering war was that it is a sort of an intense, radical environment where everything else that is involved in human nature exists, but it exists in a sort of a more intense way. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it is a very complex terrain, and you have to have a strong moral compass, while at the same time not imposing your view and your take onto your audience. That's my feeling on that one.
I've never been in the real heat of war. I've been on the edges at times in Northern Ireland and in Georgia and elsewhere. But I have had some decisions to make sometimes as an editor. And I completely agree with what you've just said about the overriding responsibility to tell the truth. Of course, insofar as a reporter can, he should also tell the surrounding truths that you outlined, reasons for having difficulties with a particularly worrying truth. It seems to me in those circumstances it's the job of the editor to commission an article either from you or from someone else to discuss the moral problems that his own people are dealing with every day. And I think that opinion journalism, reporting journalism lean on each other in this regard. Obviously, the opinion journalists lean much more heavily on the reporters than vice versa, but there is an element of cooperation there. And the questions that you're dealing with, I have what happens. The third. I mean, I've just given my view on editor's opinion journalism. What about RT? Well, I actually wrote a piece for The Spectator, and I echoed the points you've just made. But I went on to say that I thought we probably couldn't ban RT. We shouldn't, rather than couldn't. We shouldn't. We might try to get corresponding freedom in Russia and other countries for our institutions, which, of course, even when it exists, tends to be highly circumscribed by the Russian authorities. But what we can do, and what journalism, among other things, is you create a set of institutions and practices in which false journalism, fakery, either the high-minded fakery of The Guardian or the low-minded fakery of RT, and they're very different, I don't want to put them on a level, but they're both there, is exposed by other people. I mean, journalism is, among other things, it is the conduct of a moral argument in society on all its major pressing problems. And the tabloids are often more keen for that argument to go ahead. They're far less likely to avoid good stories if they are embarrassing to either the government or the particular, the ruling ethos of the day. It is the tabloids who I look to for stories about transgenderism rather than the New York Times. Eventually they'll force the Times to do it, but nonetheless, and maybe the Times will then do a better job, but they won't do it unless the tabloids constantly kicking them on the shins.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I jump in?
Okay.
Just one other thing I want to add, to follow up on what John said. Context is very important here. I'll give you a very concrete example. When I was covering Iraq, I was during the war, the Second War, I was in the north with the Kurds, but we had a correspondent in Baghdad. Now, had we not had a correspondent in Baghdad, I would have had to report the story differently. Having 2 correspondents or 3 correspondents or 4 correspondents allows you to represent one point of view, and as you say, it's the editors, the way they put that on the page produces that multiplicity of opinion or viewpoint or whatever, and that's great. Sometimes you don't have that luxury if you're working for a smaller paper, or you just can't get people in or whatever it is, and then your reporting has to reflect the fact that and strongly reflect the fact you're only seeing one side of a complicated picture. And that's all you can kind of talk about. And I think extrapolation is one of the great sins of journalism. You see something, you know you've seen that, but then you decide that that applies to everything similar, and it often doesn't.
Can I just add, I mean, isn't there I'm not a war correspondent, but in most reporting, but in war in particular, there is a sort of tendency to develop a narrative of like goodies and baddies, which often, there often are clear baddies in war. I think we're seeing them now in Russia, but often it's kind of more of a case of baddies versus baddies, and so we end up putting faith in groups who don't turn out to be as good as we want. But that kind of also applies wider, to the wider journalistic job, which is inevitably sort of develops a narrative. So they're always going to. I mean, in the British case, so British reporting, over the last 5 or 10 years has always been, like. Russia's obviously bad, and some countries are just good. So Germany's good, France is good, Canada is good, and whatever they do. And in France, you can have, Macron's chief d'affaires sort of beating the hell out of some protesters, and it kind of don't really notice. Then you have the police beating up protesters like weekly, and police beating up firemen and whatever. And then whatever happens in various things in Canada just kind of get ignored. And then Germany must be the goodie, but it's completely ignored the fact that Germany is actually much closer to Russia than Britain was, because that doesn't fit any kind of decided narrative of goodies versus baddies. And it's very hard to get out of that frame of mind if you're sort of, which a lot of reporters are sort of telling a story. So you were saying about if you're having lots of multiple reporters, that helps to sort of create more of a balance, because inevitably, if you're with people, you're going to start to sympathise with them, or you start to see their point of view. And I mean, a lot of these things in wartime presumably just come down to manpower and the size of the media operation.
They come down to a couple of things. Manpower is definitely one of them, but also perspective, experience. So, you know, basically, if you go back to the 2003 war in Iraq, the reason the Americans embedded so many journalists, and, you know, local village journalists, all kinds of journalists, and they stuck them with their military units, was they realized that if you stick a journalist in an armored car with a bunch of soldiers, they'll probably give them favorable coverage. And often they did. But there's a fantastic story written for the Sunday Times by a journalist called Mark Franchetti, who was in Iraq, in Moscow for a long, long time, until this February, actually. And he went in to fight with the US Marines. It was the US Marines. Lots of people were killed. The US Marines shot a lot of civilians. Not because they were egregiously trying to kill civilians. There was just absolute chaos and no one knew what the hell was going on. But this was the end result of it. And Mark Franchetti, even though he'd been embedded with these guys, even though he was very sympathetic to them, had the experience, the depth, and the sort of moral compass to take 10 steps back and report the good and the bad. And I recommend the story to anybody. It's 4,000 words long. It's a bit of a read. You can find it on the internet. It's a beautiful example of somebody who's part of it, but has a distance on it at the same time. So, like everything else in life, it really comes down to the quality of the journalists, the reporting, the amount of time and effort they put into it, but also the number of people. I think one thing with war, I think we have to be very careful of both sides. It's wrong to assume that every war is a 50-50 war. That's just not my experience. Some wars are 50-50. Some wars, both sides are wrong or equally wrong or roughly or 60-40 or whatever. But, you know, to take a very extreme example, if you look at the Holocaust, you wouldn't have suggested that there were two sort of equal sides to the story.
Yeah, I was suggesting
that wasn't really a counterpoint, but I guess everything from there to sort of, you know, it can be anywhere from there to sort of 50-50. For me, for example, the Bosnian War, the Bosnian Muslims really got it. You know, they really got it for the first 3 years. And if you look at the number of casualties at the end of the war, you take out the armed forces, they lost about 80% of the total losses. So to suggest that, you know, that war can be interpreted in lots of different ways, sure, there are nuances, but we have to remember that fact, that sort of central fact, I think. But other wars are much, much less clear. And I'm sorry to throw that analogy out. I realise that's not what you were saying.
I meant it's like in Syria, for example, there was a sort of narrative where we must have helped these, the liberal Democrats who are fighting against Assad, and that ended up arming a militia who I think they had 4 men in the end, and then they spent, hundreds of millions of pounds arming them. So one of my basic point is that journalists inevitably come to have a sort of narrative curation, and that, outside of war, that is a kind of inevitable process of telling a story, and it becomes hard to sort of get out of that.
I think one thing we do is we assume that the good guys are always sort of Western democratic liberals, and that's definitely not often the case.
Gladden, there's another category, political opinion. So my question is that what range of these political opinions are protected? What is the limit? What do you think?
Well, that's a big question, I guess. What range of political opinions should be permitted in speech? I'm not sure exactly how to attack it, except that we should probably start with a description of the present situation in recent years. And I regret that this is a kind of a come down from the discussion of war, which is something much more serious. But I guess politics is war by other means. So. Certainly there was as Julius was describing what happened to RT before and after February of 2022, I have to think of what life has been like on American social media platforms before and after Trump. There's always been a kind of spin in terms of what opinions are permitted. In fact, I remember, this may be a good example actually, I remember about 10 years ago, there was a story on the Wall Street Journal about red Facebook and blue Facebook. And this was about how Facebook was politically categorizing its users. And at the time, I guess Facebook's business strategy was that it was still trying to entice people to use the platform all the time. So it was giving people what they wanted. And you could go on the Wall Street Journal website and you could see red Facebook, which is conservative in the American political coloring, and blue Facebook, which is left-wing Facebook, if Facebook thought you were right-wing or left-wing. And so on the red Facebook, it would show you, for example, a story about a heroic American gun owner who stopped a massacre with his use of his legally owned firearm or something like that. And then if you were to log the same day into blue Facebook, it would talk about the dangers of unrestrained gun ownership and how it's imperative that we have immediate gun control now, something like that. So at the time, people became worried that the social media platforms were going to reinforce people's existing political opinions. But once everyone was in the online, once everyone was corralled into the platforms and Trump changed the nature of the public discussion by using the phrase fake news media, that caused a reaction by all of the media platforms who are now operating their own little miniature public squares. And at some point in the Trump administration, definitely toward the end in 2020, they too flipped a switch and started confronting everyone with left-wing political opinions. And for those of us who are political observers, at least for me, this was painfully obvious because you would go on Twitter and it would give you recommended stories that were trending stories or something like that. And you absolutely knew that these were not actually popular stories. They were trying to astroturf these stories into existence about the danger of Trump well before January 6th, or you would log on and it would say, Dr. Anthony Fauci, MD, is the single most popular doctor in the history of mankind, or something like that. And it was painfully obvious to political observers, but then maybe for a lot of people who just move along with the mainstream, they found that their own political opinions were being slightly warped. At the same time, it became, these platforms also began to introduce their own methods of control. Right before the election, there was the Hunter Biden laptop story, and basically the journalists who broke that story were absolutely unable to post on it on the major social media platforms. The New York Post, which is the oldest continuously published newspaper in America, had its account suspended, had 3 million followers, things like that. So we're certainly in a situation where the public expression of political opinion already is controlled. And before we discuss, what it should look like in an ideal circumstance, we have to acknowledge that, particularly in the West, where these platforms are dominant, the techniques for massaging and changing popular opinion and political opinion in particular are growing more sophisticated.
Just on that point, there are two sorts of guidance that now occurs, whether you want it or not. One is, if your wife says to you, what's that marvelous restaurant we went to? And you say, oh yes, I know, and you type it in. You never get the restaurant. What you get is 2 or 3 pages of restaurant guidance. 10 best restaurants in here, there and the other. It's kind of irritating. You can find it eventually. Now, that's just a minor thing. Of course, the point you're just making is applied to the serious question of what you want to see, or what you want to read. Obviously, if you're a professional journalist, you probably have noticed a good story by somebody and you want to read that. And so you try. But if it's not to the taste of the people, of the algorithms that run Google, you'll get 5 or 6 stories contradicting it first, so that you're only allowed to read it when you've been told to distrust it. Well, you should distrust these things anyway, but nonetheless there should be an equal distrust rule. And this applies also to the very difficult area of general political ideas. So that if, for example, you're interested in discussing populism, you will almost certainly have to wade through acres and acres and acres of arguments and debates which assume that there is the battle in Western politics is between something called liberal democracy and populism, the second of which is a dangerous threat to democracy. Now, that's not as bad as it was 6 months ago, because enough people have sort of pointed out the bogus character of this choice. But nonetheless, it is an ideological construction designed to persuade you to reach a certain conclusion, rather than to give you the range of debates. And I think that that kind of thing didn't much happen in the pages, the comment pages of really serious papers 30 and 40 years ago. I mean, I was in charge at one point of the Times, and when we were looking for regular columnists, we tried to balance and quite seriously be getting good people who spoke with authority on both sides. So I had Conor Cruise O'Brien, who was originally on the left and gradually became a centrist. You have to watch that. And versus Ken Minogue, the Australian political theorist, who's a sound conservative. So it really does require a priestly sense of honesty and fairness. Or if you are on a paper that's avowedly and clearly on one side, and you accept that, and that's the way you present yourself as a newspaper, then I think you have to produce the best arguments you can, both about your own arguments and your criticism of the other side. I don't think that is the attitude of the woke. They don't actually want a debate structured in such a way as to stimulate curiosity about the different points of view and to judge them fairly. And the problem is that the woke are a priesthood which is now in control of many of the gateway institutions to intellectual argument, debate and reporting in society, a kind of lumpen intelligentsia, which transmits the instructions of the political elites, political class, to the rest of the population.
Yeah, thank you very much. According to Facebook, what do you think, who should have the right to regulate, the content? Yeah, what do you think about the regulation of online platforms? Gladden, please, first.
Well, it's a complicated question. What to do now? Again, just to start with observing a funny political fact. Everyone was very excited when at least conservatives were very excited when Elon Musk, made his takeover bid of Twitter, because tons of political discussion happens on Twitter, and we thought, okay, maybe he'll restore some balance. On the other hand, it's absurd that it does require one of the richest people in the world to happen to be moved by whatever reasons he is to make that offer. That kind of contingency is so rare, and even then the process after that has been so rocky that we can hardly depend for the protection of legitimate political speech on such awkward and unusual circumstances. So yeah, these platforms have been given great power by American law, and I think that again, I'll just maybe note that fact as well, that in the 1990s, the laws that were written to allow the building of the internet platforms were constructed in such a way that the companies that created them were indemnified or exempted from the usual requirements that publishers face. So the companies which came along, like Twitter and Facebook, were not held to the same standard as the Times. They were not held to the standard of even the laxer laws in the United States surrounding publishers. So they were simply considered platforms and not publishers. So there have been different proposals for how to go about solving this issue. Would it be best to change the law and reclassify Twitter and some of these public platforms as publishers? I'm not exactly sure what the best answer to that is, but it's clear that the fundamental situation is that these companies were not envisioned by the writers of the law. We thought that the writers of these laws thought that the internet was the a nascent little thing in the 1990s, and we don't want to snuff it out before it comes into existence. But now they've recreated their own public square, a public square which, in order to join, you accept their terms of service, and basically when you sign up and you sign in and you click the little button, do you accept this agreement? And like a 300-page agreement flies in front of you, and you scroll as fast as possible to the bottom. In effect, by clicking I agree, you've become something like a medieval serf. You don't know for sure whether the platform might come and take your firstborn child, if you fail to tweet in a politically correct manner. But we're rapidly moving to that absurd situation.
We talked about free speech, hate speech, political opinion. Ed West, what do you think about fake news, and do you think fact-checking is possible for fake news, or is it mandatory? And if so, whose responsibility is it?
I'd say I'm a hardline skeptic on anything to do with fact-checking. I think it's a complete BS, just web of lies. Fact-checkers started off with good intentions, and like most things, it's just very, very highly partisan. Jacob Segal in the Tablet had a very good article about that. I think it was earlier this year, and he was pointing to how it's basically narrative. It's creating a narrative, and our fact-checkers, the three big stories with Biden's laptop. It was about Trump's claims about vaccines, which turned out to be correct. There was another, and he cited another example where the government was giving out, the American government was giving out basically crack pipes, and it was actually, false. The pipe was off of meth or something like that. And there's this kind of thing where, partly true, which is, okay, it's essentially true, but, we don't really like it, so we're just going to sort of think, or the thing is, the word often used is nuance. If anyone ever says nuance, you can just sort of instantly, alarm bells saying, because that just basically means I don't like what this is, but I have to accept it's basically true. But you have to take it in a nuanced way. I think he cited there are sort of over 340 fact-checking organizations now, often run by NGOs or government departments with their own agenda. I'm very, very suspicious. Even Snopes used to started off as quite a good one, and now it's you go on and it's comically one-sided. This is to the sort of previous question. It comes back to the point where groups, organizations and companies like Google have unprecedented power. Nothing, no company, no organization has had anything like that sort of power in the past, and we're dealing with something quite new. And the problem with this, the problem with the fact checkers and the problem with sort of social media companies is, if you have a company where 97% of donations to the company go to the Democrats, or 97 or 98% of the people there support one party, it's almost impossible to be an impartial public service. It's just human nature. You have this incredible, strong sense of kind of hyper-partisanship, and especially when the product is itself feeding this acceleration of kind of political extremism. You see, in the last 10 years, the opinion of the average university-educated American has so changed by any measurement on sort of most social issues, especially to the key areas of race, immigration, gender. They've radically transformed like almost no other set of public opinions in sort of modern history, heavily affected by the use of the iPhone and Twitter and social media. And when you have what is basically the most influential segment in the world changing that drastically, and the same people who run these incredibly powerful platforms, it's very hard to regulate them. We could have fact checkers who check the fact checkers, but they're going to be from pretty much the same sort of segment of society. And then you have Twitter. I love Twitter, and it's great, and it's really useful for journalists, but it's basically completely incompatible with any kind of public debate. It's just impossible, mainly because it's full of journalists, and they're terrible people, and as Nassim Taleb said, journalists tend to be quite conformist. They want to be popular. So, the the kind of, the Overton window of what is acceptable has shifted quite a lot, even in our time. A lot of the sort of things are, if you find any quote or sort of any policy proposal of Trump, which is universally condemned as like fascistic or something, most of it will be pretty much the same as what the Clinton government are doing, but a lot of it would also be pretty much the same what the Obama government is doing. But just people's view of what is normal has changed so much, and that's because the kind of nature of progressivism has to kind of basically move forward. It has to go to more and more extremes. It's a competition for more kind of extreme opinions, and which guided by social media. So the same people can't. The whole point of a fact checker is basically to curate that narrative and to be on the side of right and wrong.
Just jump in for 1 second. It's a very interesting thing, this fact checking, and I am definitely not well versed in the subject, but I have noticed, for example, on the Ukrainian coverage, that the New York Times has a serious fact checking facility. The BBC have a fact checking facility. I haven't looked into it in depth, but I looked at one particular allegation that Ukrainian soldiers had shot Russian prisoners of war in the legs. And I don't want to set myself up in counterpoint here, but the BBC did a fantastic fact-checking job on it, and they came back at the end of a very sort of long explanation, and they said, yes, it probably happened. That was their conclusion, which for me was fine. They didn't have to call it one way or the other. But going back to what Ed was saying, this I'm in total agreement with him, is that I think the real enemy here is groupthink. It's this. And you have to look at incentives to understand why groupthink exists. And if you incentivize people, if people are rewarded for parroting, producing, reiterating the same opinions as their bosses or their peers or whatever, you're always going to have trouble. I went over very briefly in my career to the dark side, and I worked for NATO in Afghanistan. I was a British political officer in Helmand in a frontline position for 9 months, and it was absolutely fascinating. My personal view on Afghanistan is that we absolutely screwed it up. But what was fascinating was watching the minutiae of the decisions that led to that 20-year kind of mess, and watching it from the inside rather than from the outside of as a journalist. And what I came back to again and again and again was the sort of overwhelming groupthink that was fed by people who were incentivized to follow the crowd. And ultimately, it seemed to make sense on a day-to-day basis. And then you look at this whole thing over 20 years and you think, how did we manage to do that?
Yeah.
How did we spend trillions of dollars, lose thousands of people, kill tens or hundreds of thousands of Afghans in the mess? It's not just about our side. How did we manage to do that and then end up back in the place that we started? And I regret the fact that there's no soul searching now about it. There's no real debate about it. It's kind of disappeared. And the problem with that is we're liable to make the same mistake again. So at some point we have to look at these mechanisms and examine them very carefully. And in that sense, I'm in total agreement with this idea that fact checkers just become reiterators of the original narrative.
Yes.
I should
Sorry.
Can
So
I just
we have time for one short
okay.
react.
Well, I just want to respond to actually you, Ed. I agree. The BBC fact-checking on Ukraine has been very good, it seemed to me, and I'm very critical of fact-checking in general. It doesn't seem, but there was an important point you were making, Ed, and that is this change of opinion of the upper class in the upper middle class in the United States. We can trace when it began. Academic research has discovered it begins in 2011, when the newspapers like the major metropolitan dailies start using words like white supremacist to describe the United States. And all of the terms we've become familiar with since began to come into our minds via the higher journalism, so to speak. Trump was a factor in aggravating that. He made matters worse because he terrified the people who were running that kind of operation. But there is no doubt that the introduction of an extreme point of view by past, according to all past standards, into the serious journalism was something that has changed all of the important debates in American life, because the leadership class has adopted a standpoint that is radically at variance, hostile to the opinions of 70% of the American population.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and John O'Sullivan, Adam Papin, Ed West, and Julius Strauss, thank you very much for the discussion, and thank you for the audience as well for being here, and yeah, see you in the city of Esztergom. Thank you very much.